I also just wanted to introduce Karen, our speaker for tonight. She's an archaeologist at Archaeology Southwest. She grew up in Tempe, so she's a local person. She did her undergrad at Stanford, and she got her master's and her doctorate at ASU. She's worked at a variety of places outside the American Southwest, including Peru and Ethiopia, as well as a variety of different parts of the American Southwest. She does a variety of different things, but zoo archaeology is one of her big research interests, as well as looking at human-environmental interaction, looking at food security and landscape use of past peoples. And she's been doing field work in the American Southwest and Southwest New Mexico, in the Mimbres region culture area for about 15 years. And tonight, she's going to be drawing on some of her research she's been doing in Archaeology Southwest, including some of the work with the field school. So please come welcome Karen.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming tonight, especially since it's a little rainy. I know that can be scary for those of us in Tucson, so thanks for coming out. I'm excited to be here tonight and talk about this work. As John mentioned, I work at Archaeology Southwest, and one of the main things I do there is I teach a field school every summer, which is one of my favorite things to do. I get to work on really interesting research, and I get to be part of teaching the next generation of archaeologists how to do archaeology, and both of those things are really fun, and the Upper Gila is a good place to do that. So I'm happy to be talking about some of that tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our field school, what a field school does for people who aren't sure. I'll talk more about our research in the Upper Gila, and then about some new things from our work at the Hoover Farm site in southwest New Mexico. And they're really new things because our field visit just ended. I got home 10 days ago. So a lot of this is really the very latest things from Hoover Farm. It should be fun. I want to talk first about the people that I work with, because archaeology is really always teamwork. And our team's really important to this, and even though I get to be up here talking about this tonight, I don't do any of this by myself. I spend a little bit of time telling some people what to do in the summer, but really all of this is a lot of people working together. This project started, the Archaeology Southwest Field School started a while before me. Brett Hill was one of the directors, and then Deb Huntley, and then I came along, and Jeff Clark is like co-PI on the project. And we also have a really great crew of field school staff who come out. Some of them have been out on this project longer than I have. Our field director, Leslie Aragon, started a year before I did. Alan DeNoyer does experimental archaeology. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we have a bunch of other people that I'm thanking on this slide who've been part of this project. So the research that I'm talking about is really research that involved a big group of other people who work with me. And it also involved a lot of students. So here you can see our crews since 2014, which is when I started working on this project. And they do a lot of work. And they also make it a lot of fun, and they come up with new ideas every year, and they're really fun to get to know. And they also keep me sort of current. I come home with new music on my phone every year after this project. When something comes on that my husband has never heard, meaning it's less than 20 years old, he's like, "What is this?" I say, "Oh, my students at field school." So, so thanks guys for keeping me up to date on things. Our field school teaches some pretty traditional field school things. The students learn excavation, they learn basic lab analysis of the things that we find in the field, they get introduced to archaeological survey, and we do some experimental archaeology, which isn't quite such a standard thing. But Alan DeNoyer teaches this, and our students do things like build replica Pueblo rooms from the 1300s. As you can see in this slide, they've actually built now 2 adobe structures that look a lot like the ones that were excavated from the 1300s. They do flint knapping, throwing out laterals and things like that, and that really helps all of us. It helps us understand the things that we're finding a lot better, and it also kind of gives people appreciation for how much work went into these things. It takes a long time to build one of these adobe rooms. And then a few less standard things we do quite a bit of public outreach, and our students are involved in that in the summer. We do things like kids' library programs. People come out and visit the site. We have a fair at the end of the year where our students do projects, and the local community is invited to come out and see them. And then Alan especially goes out to the community a couple more times during the year to talk about the archaeology that's there. And that's really important for us because one of the goals of our field school is to encourage preservation. And so telling the people who live right there about what we're finding in the place where they live is really important so that they see why we keep coming back. And the kinds of things that we're working on and why the sites that are in their community are still important to archaeologists really all over the country. And there's still a lot of really interesting things to be learned from those places. So we try and get back to the community a couple times a year to talk about what we're doing and what we're finding. And then we take field trips around the Southwest, and that's partly for fun because we have to do something on our days off. Our students don't have cars, we don't want them to sit around in camp playing cards, but they're actually really important educationally too, because we take people to other archaeological sites, for one thing, Chaco Canyon, Gila Cliff Dwellings, places like that, so they can get exposed to the different culture areas and time periods that they've probably heard about in classes but not necessarily seen. And then we go to places like Zuni Pueblo, Acoma Pueblo, the Toronto Autumn Cultural Center down in Cells. So our students get to meet people whose ancestors may once have lived in the very area where we're working. And we can tell people that these people might have living descendants today, and that doesn't sink in as much as actually meeting people who are probably related. So that's a really important part of what we do as well. And then another important thing for our students really is that they're living outside and we don't have cell phone service most of the time. And back when I went to field school, we didn't have cell phones, that wasn't that big a deal, but now it's really, really different. And it's kind of a special experience for people to be out camping with no electricity and away from their phones. And it's really, some of our students go on to become archaeologists and some of them don't, but I think the ones who don't are still really impacted by parts of this experience. One is the amount of teamwork that we do, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then one is that living outside experience. We always have a handful of people who've never been camping, so their exposure to camping is 6 weeks living in a tent. It's kind of a trial by fire, but it's really a fun thing to see how that affects people and how people change through this experience. We can do this partly because of support from the National Science Foundation. We have a grant from the Research Experience for Undergraduates program, which is really designed to support undergraduates being involved in research projects. Field schools can be kind of awkward for an aspiring archaeologist because they're usually in the summer, so not only do students have to give up their summer job and the time to be earning money during the summer, but then they have to sign up for a bunch of credit hours in the summer, and that really puts it financially out of reach for a lot of people. And the RU program supports the students who come with a stipend that substantially reduces the cost of enrolling in the field school. And a lot of our best students every year have told me, like, I would never have been able to come without this program. So having that RU grant available is really important. The National Science Foundation has those RU grants for a lot of different fields to get more undergraduates involved in scientific research. And it's a really great program. I'm a big fan of it. I can't say enough good things about that. So every summer we have 12 undergraduates who come on this field school who are supported by that RU program. And it's been a really great experience for all of us. As I mentioned, part of it's to get more undergraduates involved in research and a more diverse group of undergraduates than just the ones who happen to be able to afford it. So since 2011, when field school started, this program's trained 99 students. Since I came in 2014, there's been 66 graduate and undergraduate students. And we're trying to, as I said, get a lot of people involved in archaeology. So one of our groups that we've reached out to, especially in advertising, has been students at community colleges. Because although those have nice small classes where you get to know your professors really well, they don't necessarily have a whole lot of different labs to choose from to work in. So this is a place where we can reach students who might otherwise not get to be hands-on involved in scientific research. So this has been really great for us. We've had students from 27 states, and they're all really different from each other. So we tend to get a really diverse group. And sometimes diversity is easy and sometimes it's hard. You can see this group of students who look like they're having a bitter argument. I think they're talking about dirt or something, but I like the slides. They look like they're having such a heated discussion. But we do get people from a whole lot of different backgrounds. And that's part of what makes field schools in general a good thing. We hear a lot lately about people living in a bubble and how people tend to only interact with people who are similar to them. And when you're camping for 6 weeks with somebody and using outhouses in the same row of 4 outhouses and standing in line at dinner, you can't live in a bubble. You have to interact with all the people who are out here with you. So sometimes you get stuck with some people you might not necessarily choose, and that can be really hard. But when you're close together, to some extent you're forced to work things out. And when that diversity actually works and people get to know each other and click and start working as a team that all cares about the same things, it's kind of a magic thing to see people open up to each other and start interacting in a different kind of way. So that's been really fun for us also. We're not just doing good archaeological research, but we're having a really good educational and social experience, and it just knowing some of the students that I've met has made me think about things in a really different way than I probably would have if I hadn't met these guys. Here's some of the things that our students go on to do. A lot of them go on to attend professional meetings. Some of our funding from the NSF is actually used to help some of our students go on to support the research that they started when they worked with us, and go on and present that at national conferences and local conferences. So they've gotten to go to some pretty interesting places for the SAA meetings. Some of them have gone on to, a lot of our community college students have gone on to four-year colleges. Some go on to do internships. Some have gotten MA degrees since I started in 2014. And we've got several of them in PhD programs in different archaeological careers around the Southwest. So one of the good things about Facebook is actually that I get to see all these pictures the students are posting of themselves in their new jobs. Selena Soto, who's at the bottom with the Forest Service hat, she was one of the people who had, I think, never been camping. And at the end of our field school, she said, I don't know if I really like the Southwest, and I don't know if I really like being outside, and there's a lot of bugs. Well, she's not only an archaeologist now, but she's a wildlands firefighter at the Grand Canyon. So she's now much tougher than me. And I think that's really great. That's one of the things that this program lets people do, is find this whole new side to themselves and explore something that they might not have done otherwise. So that's a little bit of the student training part. And I'm going to move on to talk more about the research that we're doing and why we're out there. We're working in a period and a culture area that archaeologists call Salado. And in southwest New Mexico, Salado is called the cliff phase. Archaeologists love to subdivide things, of course. So Salado is the larger area you can see on the slide. Cliff phase is really just the part in southwest New Mexico. So if you hear me accidentally say cliff phase, that's the southwest New Mexico Salado that I'm talking about. The dates are 1300 to 1450 plus, which is kind of vague, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And you can see that the Salado culture area overlaps the traditional ones, Ho'oklam and Magillon, that you have probably heard of a lot. And this is a really interesting thing also, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And the upper Gila is where this red arrow is pointing. So Archaeology Southwest since, I think maybe 2009, and at least since 2011, has been working on archaeological sites in the Salado area along the upper Gila, trying to understand how the large communities in this area formed. And that's what this project is still focused on. If you look at what's happening in this area over time, between 1000 and 1130, in this part of southwest New Mexico, we see classic embrace villages. And that's another one of the sort of famous southwestern culture area time periods. People are living in large masonry villages, close to the edges of floodplains, and they're making this really famous black and white pottery that you've probably seen in museums. It's one on postage stamps, it's very well known. And in this time period, everybody's doing things in fairly similar ways. The villages are all built of masonry that's been described as marbles and mud. It's really cobbles stacked in mud. And everybody's making very, very similar pots, those famous black and white pots. And you don't usually find pots from a lot of other areas in these sites. It looks like people during the classic embrace period are really emphasizing, at least through their pottery, a sort of inward social focus. We're all making the same thing, we're all doing this the same way. Those sites are really easy for archaeologists to identify. Again, we're talking about archaeological culture areas, so identifying these groups is based on their stuff. And when all their stuff looks the same, it's really easy for us to say, oh, classic embraces in this area at this time. We can draw neat little circles around the places where people are living and put dates on them. At 1130, it gets very messy in southwest New Mexico in general, including the upper Gila. People stop living in those villages, and they start to do things in a variety of different ways. And in the upper Gila that we're talking about, this time period, the later 1100s and the 1200s is called Tularosa phase. And people are emphasizing social connections to areas to the north. So they're not making those really well-known black and white pots anymore. They're not living in the same kinds of villages. There don't seem to be very many people left on the upper Gila at this time that archaeologists can see. There are some large sites in the area, but there's not very many of them. So either a lot of people move away in the 1200s, or maybe many people are dispersed such on the landscape and moving around often enough that they're archaeologically invisible. But we can't see a lot of people in the 1200s. So we have a period of big villages, lots of people doing things in very similar ways, and then a period of fewer people doing things in a different way. And then around 1300, we see a lot of big villages forming again. And that's when we get into the cliff phase or the Salado time period. So we've got big villages, dispersed occupation, big villages again. What is making the second round of big villages look different? What's causing them to form? and how do they compare to what was happening in this area earlier on? These are some of the questions that we're interested in. We think a big part of the answer to what these villages, how they formed and what makes them, is that people are moving at this time. So remember I said in the 1200s, it looks to archaeologists like there's a lot fewer people. In the 1300s we get more people again, and a lot of new people are probably moving in. If you think about what's happening elsewhere in the Southwest in the late 1200s, in the Four Corners area, it's a difficult time in the late 1200s, like 1280 or so. This is right when the Mesa Verde area is, archaeologically speaking, emptying out. It looks like a lot of people are moving out of that area, and they're moving towards the Rio Grande. The same kinds of things are happening in the Kayenta area in northeastern Arizona. There's probably some resource stress that's been building up. There's social tensions. There's various sets of problems that are contributing to people not liking it where they are and thinking, what we're doing socially really isn't working right now, and we need to try something else. So they move away. And as I said, people in southwest Colorado around Mesa Verde are probably moving east and south. People in northeastern Arizona and the Kayenta region are moving south. I'll talk about how we see this in a minute. But they're moving to southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. And those people from the Kayenta area moving south and moving in with people who are already there, people archaeologists call Hohokam and Mugion, and mixing cultural traditions, that is what's forming Salado. So when I showed you that map that had Salado as an overlay of other culture areas, that's why, because Salado is formed out of pieces of those earlier culture areas, archaeologically speaking. A lot of this work is coming from things that Jeff Clark and Patrick Lyons and other people at Archaeology Southwest and the Arizona State Museum and other places have been doing. But one of the ways that we can see Kayenta traditions and we can see these people moving is that they take their ways of doing things with them. So things show up in the Hohokam and Mugion regions that haven't traditionally been in those regions before and have been in the Kayenta area. One of those things is that people take their way of building houses with them. So people start to build houses that look a lot like the way people build houses in the Kayenta area, but now those kinds of structures are showing up down around southeastern Arizona, down in southwest New Mexico. We also see people's stuff showing up there. So we see painted pottery and we see unpainted pottery. Painted pottery is always a problem for archaeologists, right? Pots don't equal people, so you have to think about, well, how did those pots get there? Did a person actually bring them? Did a person make them? Or did that get traded in? That's a problem for decorated pottery, but that's not quite such an issue for unpainted things. Usually they don't get traded far and wide if it's just a plain piece of pottery. So an important artifact type for this research is called a perforated plate, which you can see an example of a particularly nice one on this slide. They don't always look like that good. But this is really a household item. And this is something that people were making in the Kayenta area. And it's probably a mold for forming the base of the pot, is my favorite explanation that I've heard at least. And that's Patrick Lyons' explanation, so yay. But it's probably a mold, like something like a puki for forming the base of the pot. There's a lot of different ideas about what the holes are, and nobody's terribly confident about what those are. You can see the holes on this one look nice and regular and they go all the way through, but sometimes the holes are irregularly spaced. Sometimes they don't even go all the way through the clay. So we're not sure what they're for. But this is a very utilitarian household item, and it's not something that's going to really get traded for a long distance. So when we start seeing these showing up in places in the Southwest where they weren't before, along with ways of building a house and along with the decorated pottery, that's one of these things that says, oh, it's really people moving here. It's not just pots getting traded, because you're not going to get these perforated plates traded for a long distance. So really, the main way that we're coming up with this idea that Kayenta people are moving into these other areas and mixing their traditions in is by looking at these key items of theirs that start showing up to the south. When people start moving around, things often get a little tense. This particularly is coming from Jeff Clark, but when we see these Kayenta migrants arriving in places, at first it looks like people are a little bit worried. So, especially in San Pedro Valley, a lot of work. And I'm here showing that there's Kayenta enclaves sort of in the south end of the valley, and some of these places are set up in a very defensive way. So what's one of the things that people start to do when they get worried about a whole bunch of immigrants coming in? They build walls. So you can actually see this in some of the sites on the San Pedro. There are actually walls kind of walling off the ends of mesas where people are living as sort of this is showing people are worried about all the social changes that are happening, and the new people that are moving into the place where they live, and the new people that are coming in are worried about the relationships with the people who are already there. And just things are a little bit tense. There's spatial separation between groups, and it's like people are looking at each other sideways a little bit. But within a fairly short time, like a generation or two, we start to see this easing up a little bit already. People are mixing together more and they're sharing ideas, and if you imagine living in a village from this time period, these villages aren't that big. It's not like you could avoid interacting with the new people very easily. So you're seeing these people every day, and you eventually realize, oh, they're just people, and they're neighbors, and I'm used to them, and people don't get so tense about it anymore, and they can start to share things. And what's probably happening is they're forming these new traditions that include items, traditions from the people from the Kayenta area, and things that were already there. So in the Hokom area, there's one set of things that changes when the Kayenta migrants come in. In the Mugyeon area, which I'm talking about more, there's another set of things that we can see sort of change as we see the Mugyeon and Kayenta traditions mixing together. So the use of perforated plates continues. We're finding perforated plates in these sites. And again, that's never a thing that was in the Mugyeon area before. It's just after the Kayenta migrants come in. We see Roosevelt redware or Salado polychrome pottery, and this is linked to the Salado phenomenon, as archaeologists call it. This is linked to this new tradition that's forming. And a lot of the designs are probably referencing important iconography from Mesoamerica, which a lot of people suggest has a function of bringing diverse groups together and bringing people together into a coherent sort of group. It looks nothing like the classic Mimbres black and white pottery I was showing you before. It doesn't look anything like the true Lotus Face pottery either. It doesn't look that much like the Kayenta pottery either, although it has some design things that carry over. It's kind of a new style. But one of the really cool things that we see in the former Mugyeon area in southwest New Mexico is that we see things that have Roosevelt redware decoration on the outside, but the insides are smudged black. So like that pot in the bottom corner, you can see the inside is black, and smudging is a very traditional Mugyeon way of making a pot. When you fire the pot, you get soot on the inside that's polished in on purpose. It's not actually paint, although it looks like it. But that's like a very Mugyeon style inside of a very clearly Salado pot, which is really neat to me, that the traditions are combining that way that we can see so well. And then we get some traditionally Mugyeon features in these rooms too, like these kneeling bins, which are a place where 2 bowls are set into the floor, plastered in, and then you have a couple of metates with manos set up next to them so that you could kind of brace your feet against the wall, and you could grind on the grinding stones and push your flour into these bowls and collect it. That's not something that was being done probably in the Kayenta area, but it is something that had been around Mugyeon for a while. So that's another way that we see, like there's Mugyeon traditions already there, there's Kayenta traditions that are new, and they're both present in these communities. And we can see that these communities are including all the people with these different backgrounds now that they all live together in the same place. So I'm not necessarily saying that that was a really easy thing. It was probably kind of a tough transition to live through at the time. But again, people in forced proximity get used to each other and they work things out, and we can see that happening then. And within a couple generations, everything's okay. And people are living together, and we don't see evidence of big differences in room size or where in the site people are living or what kinds of resources they have access to or anything like that. It doesn't look like we have a bunch of disenfranchised people. We have everybody living in a very similar way, even though their ancestors may have come from different places. So that's got some pretty obvious implications for social problems that we have now, and that's one of the reasons that this area is really interesting and a really good place to look at, to understand, well, how do these kinds of things happen? How do people work out this kind of stuff that we're still dealing with working out now? So the Cliff Valley is a really good place to look at this because there are a lot of large Salado sites there. They've all been looted to some extent, but despite that, they're in pretty good shape. And we can see a lot of different kinds of examples of how these processes occur and how these multi-ethnic communities are formed. So I'm going to talk mostly about the Hoover Farm site tonight, but there's a bunch of villages, Salado villages in the Cliff Valley that different people have worked on that kind of show these processes and how it happened in a slightly different way in every village, perhaps. So there's not just one answer to how to do this. There's a lot of different ways to form these multi-ethnic communities, and we can really learn a lot about those options by looking at these different sites. So Hoover Farm is where we've been working since 2016, and it's a large Salado village, and it's really teaching us a lot about some of the interesting ways that we can see these processes of Salado kind of emerging and what Salado looked like and how it worked. So one of the fun things about working here is we've got 2 different sort of excavation strategies going on. Every year we sample parts of a few key rooms that we've picked, and we just dig part of the room. So we dig like a third to a half of the rooms that we've chosen, and then we leave the rest of it unexcavated so that future archaeologists who disagree vehemently with me and Jeff and all of us tomorrow or in 50 years can come back and they can potentially work in the same rooms and get more information. Or if we decide we need more information about a room, we can come back, part of the deposits left. So we talk a lot with our students about how to balance preservation with digging, and how we pick the rooms that we're going to work in, how we're not digging the whole room and we're not digging the whole site. Not only would it be financially impossible to do that, but it's also bad for the site. So we're digging in targeted areas and we focus on rooms in those areas. And then when we finish those rooms, we dig a whole bunch of shallow wall trenches to try and get an idea of what the plan view of the site looks like. So when we started working at Hoover Farm, all we had was a survey map from 1983. And there was sort of a vague sketch drawing of 2 mounded areas and some other room blocks that we had a lot of trouble relocating. One of the mounded areas is no longer a mound, it's a completely flat field. So that southern room block that you see, if you were to stand up there right now, all you would see was flat dirt. It got used as a seed farm, and sometime between 83 and now it got totally flat. But there's still quite a bit of deposit there. We can still learn a lot from a place that somebody might look at and say like, oh, there's nothing left. Well, that's still a good place to preserve because we've learned a lot from working in that flat area. So this is a map of what we knew last year, based on 2016, 2017. We dug a lot of wall trenches with our students. We thought we had a pretty good plan map of what the site looked like. We thought there was a big square room block to the north, and sort of an L or I-shaped one to the south of it. And then you're getting a hint of this already. You can see the aerial photo underneath it is actually from this past field season. Aaron Wright came out with a drone and took photos for us and taught our students how to fly the drone, which they really liked. And you can see the aerial photo underneath showing our new excavations. This is what the site looks like this year. So with those wall trenches, we completely changed our view of what the southern room block looked like, especially. We thought it was sort of an L shape, and now we think it may actually be a large square with an open closet in the center. Unfortunately, as tends to happen, the southern wall and the eastern wall of that southern room block we found the last 3 days of the season. So we haven't had a chance to look in the center and see if that's actually a closet or not. So now Jeff and I have to write another grant to see if we can go back. But it's, again, just a little bit of wall trenching. They're shallow trenches. They're like this deep for the most part. Some of them are deeper. We can't find a wall, but most of them, they're like the shallowest trenching we can do. They're the least disturbance we can do, just poking through the surface of the site where it's been plowed. And we've completely changed our view of what this place looked like. It doesn't look like the 1983 map at all either. So it's been really fun to see how much we can figure out with really relatively little digging, and especially relatively little deep digging. We're not disturbing a lot of the intact deposits. We're digging through like a plow zone, basically. And we've really learned a lot from it. Some of the really neat things that we found that tell us about Salado and what Salado looks like from the Hoover Farm site is we have found a bunch of these perforated plates and mealing bins that I was talking about as examples of how Kayenta and Mogollon traditions are both holding out. If I had talked to you 10 weeks ago, I would have told you that all the perforated plates are in the southern room block and the mealing features are in the northern room block. So we were thinking, oh, maybe there's a stronger link to Kayenta in the southern room block, and maybe there's a stronger Mogollon link to the northern room block. The Hoover Farm site has a way of, every time we think we see a pattern, it's like, oh no, honey. So that's what happened this year. We found perforated plates in the northern room block too, and we found mealing bins in the southern room block too. So we don't have a spatial separation anymore of more Kayenta, more Mogollon. There's still more perforated plates to the south. Jeff talks a lot about that and why that might be, but that we don't have really strong spatial patterns of different influences in different areas a year ago. So archaeologists, we often come to an understanding of things through finding repeated patterns, and every time we think we find a repeated pattern at Hoover Farm, the pattern changes. It's like the site won't let us find a repeating pattern. I think it wants us to stay. Another thing that's been really interesting and different in every room that we've worked in is that many of these rooms have very interesting closure deposits in them. So when people stop living in the room, they do a special thing in there, not necessarily right when they leave, but sometime after they've left. They're leaving things in the rooms on purpose. We don't know why, but we can see the things that are left. One room in the northern room block burned, and I'll talk a little bit more about that room later, but we had a very nice burned roof that collapsed on top of the floor and the hearth. But on top of the hearth, in fill, so after the hearth was not used anymore, but before the roof burned down, people had put a set of stone axes that were in various stages of manufacture and use, just arranged on top of the hearth, so that's definitely on purpose. And ground stone from the site is really interesting because that's actually another place where we can see Kayenta and Muggian influences mixing together, we have a mix of what I think of as regular monos, since I've worked in the Muggian area mostly, and finger groove monos, which are more northern style. We see a mix of 3/4 groove and full grooved axes. You can actually see that in this slide. So people left this set of axes in this hearth. Another room in that same room block had a kneeling bin that had monos in various stages of wear left in it. There was a great big one, about this big, it looked like a brick. It was basically unused. All the way down to one of these ones that has 3 faces on it that's ground, so you can hardly imagine even holding it. It's been used so much, and several ones in between. Again, put underneath actually the pulled up metates from the kneeling feature. So again, people are leaving things in various stages of manufacture and use on purpose in a room after they're no longer living in that room. So those are from the same block of rooms. And if we look in the room block to the south, there was a room which had bird limbs placed in the fill above the floor. So people stopped living in the room, some time passed and fill accumulated on the floor, and then hawk wings and legs, egret and loon wings and legs were placed in this fill. We think they were probably articulated when they were put in there, but then they got a little bit messed around with. So we're not finding articulated limbs, we're finding like all the bones from a left wing pretty close together, and all the bones from a right leg pretty close together, as though they were left in the room intact and the room was left open and rodents ran around in there and kind of messed them up a little bit. So that's something that's happening not right when the room went out of use, but sometime after people stopped living in it and people were still doing things at the site. Another interesting example of this from that same room block, we had a room which had a bunch of deer scapulae in the fill above the floor. So the same kind of stratigraphic layer as I was talking about with the bird wings and limbs, but a bunch of deer scapulae. So again, people are leaving all these things on purpose in these rooms. We don't really know why, but it's really interesting to think these were important enough places for people to go back and put things in there on purpose and leave those things and let the room kind of decay around them. Another interesting thing in that room with the deer scapulae is that that's the only room so far at this particular site where we have remodeling. We have a remodeled floor. So there was a plaster floor, and then some fill in between, and then another plaster floor, more fill, and the deer scapulae. The fill between the floors is full of fishbone, which is to me one of the very weirdest things of all about Hoover Farm, is it has so many fishbones in it. So that room has this layer of fishbone between the 2 floors. There's another room we worked on that had a layer of fishbone in the fill above the floor. And this is a lot of fishbone, more than 400 pieces. I would say it's probably more like 600 pieces, but I haven't actually counted them yet, so I don't want to go like too crazy. But there's lots and lots of fishbone. The most fishbone from any other site. I'm working on a project where I'm trying to collect all of the faunal data that exist from the Mimbres-Mogollon area in southwest New Mexico. So I have data from close to 100 assemblages. And the most fishbone from any of them is from another site called Thornholt, which is another Archaeology Southwest project, also in the upper Gila. 192 fishbones, they were all from a floor pit, basically. A few from other places, but almost all of them were from a pit in a floor. So that's the second most fishbones. After that, we get to sites with way fewer fishbones. Woodrow Ruin, WS Ranch have a fair number, but 96 of the assemblages from southwest New Mexico that I looked at have 0 fishbones. So this is really unusual. When I say it's a lot of fishbones, it's like jaw-droppingly a lot. And I don't know if most people's jaws drop about fishbones, but mine does. This is so many fishbones, and it's very, very unusual. It's a very unusual thing. And people will often think, well, oh, maybe it's something about the environmental setting of the site, but all the big sites are by rivers. They're very similar settings. All these large habitation sites for like an 800-year time period, they're by rivers, and none of them have as many fishbones. So it's not just something about where the site's located. I think it's definitely a cultural thing. There's a cultural reason that people at this site have a whole bunch of fishbones in some of their rooms, and people at other sites don't. I don't know what that cultural reason is, because like I said, archaeologists depend on patterns, repeating patterns, and we have a sample size of 1, so it's not going to be a good repeating pattern, but there's definitely special contexts where there are a lot of fishbones, and they seem to be very, very rare, and I'm not sure what they are, but we have 2 of those special contexts, which are rooms at Hoover Farm, and 1 special context, that pit at Thornholt, and then practically no one else has any fish ever. It's also probably not screen size. There's been different projects to screen different ways in these areas, and it doesn't look like people are just missing the fish bones. a project I worked on in the Eastern Members, we actually window screened everything. Peggy Nelson is in the audience, and she was, the reason for this, basically, she wanted to see if there really were fish bones, and we window screened every single thing we got out of the sites, and we didn't find any fish bones at all, 0. So it's really not screen size either, those were also by rivers. So this is really a mystery. I don't know why there's so many fish bones, but I'm very intrigued by it. So far, they seem to be Cyclidae, which is a minnow family, and I haven't identified them beyond that, but I'm hoping to find some people at UNM who can help me with that in the next year or so. Another interesting water-related resource thing from Hoover Farm. There's a site called Dinwiddie where our field school worked before Hoover Farm, and Chris Lang has analyzed the shell for us, and she says that there's interesting evidence of shell working. People are making jewelry out of some of the shell at Dinwiddie, but it's not imported shell. It's actually anodonta, which is a native freshwater mussel that's very, very tiny. And I know from working with Chris that you can only work this shell for a day or 2 after you pick it up, and then it becomes so brittle you can't make anything out of it. So that means that people are actually making things with the shell at the site of Dinwiddie, which is important because there's been some argument about the actual historic distribution of that freshwater mussel, because it's something that you don't find in practically any of these rivers today. It depends on flowing water, and it reproduces in the gills of the fish, and most of these rivers don't have flowing water in them now. So we're actually not sure what the range of these mussels was. So it's interesting to have a site where we know people were right there making things out of the shell. I can't imagine somebody running with a sack full of anodonta from another river far away. They're really probably coming from right there at the site, so we know that those mussels were living there in the past. Another thing that Hoover Farm is probably going to be, hopefully, very important for is helping us date this time period better. So when I started this talk, I was saying 1300 to 1450 plus isn't perhaps the ideal date range that one could give a site. The 1450 date right now is based on work in Arizona, and we don't really have good dates for this time period from southwestern New Mexico. It's kind of problematic for a couple of reasons. Most of the wood that we find is cottonwood, so it doesn't tree ring date. And if you try to radiocarbon date things, the curve is fairly flat in this time period. So if we'd sent something out for traditional radiocarbon dating, we probably would have gotten back a date range we paid quite a bit of money for that said sometime between 1300 and 1450 plus. So we hadn't done that up till now. But Greg Hodgins and some other people at U of A have been working on a radiocarbon dating method called wiggle matching, which we're hoping will help with this problem. And to do that, we're hoping with funding from the AHS, so thanks everybody, to send in some tree ring samples and some pieces of corn from that burned room that I talked about that had the roof that burned and fell down on the hearth. And those are very good candidates potentially for this wiggle matching dating. So we're very hopeful that if this works out the way that we planned, we may get a better set of dates for this time period in southwest New Mexico than the ones we have, which again are mostly guesses based on pottery and dates from Arizona. So that's another really good thing about Hoover Farm is that it could potentially help us solve this dating problem. Don't worry, we're still spending in our tree ring samples, but so far they never seem to work because they're complacent juniper or pinon or else they're cottonwood. Another interesting thing that we see at Hoover Farm and other sites in the Upper Gila is that there's some evidence that mobility looks a little bit different than it did in earlier time periods. So when I was talking at the beginning about classic newberries, many of us think that those are fairly long-lived villages. At least part of the population there is staying there for quite a long time. And if you look at things like how much wear is occurring to the plaster floor as people walk over it, how many times do they have to replaster it to keep it in good shape, what's happening to the posts, do you have to repair them as they stand for a long time and start to rot, things like that, there's a lot of indications that those classic newberry rooms are used for quite a long time. One of our students, Steve Uzzle, did an SAA poster where he looked at differences in mobility and some of these same things in the cliff face sites, and he was testing out an idea from the 70s that said that people move between fallow river valleys, and that there was a lot of mobility of people who were living in these villages in the Upper Gila. They look like big permanent villages to us archaeologically. But the idea was that people were actually moving back and forth between valleys, and they weren't staying in one village for perhaps all that long at a time. And I never really thought that hard about this. It was an idea that got published, and then people kind of stopped talking about it, and I kind of forgot about it. But one of the good things about working with students is they don't have the same intellectual baggage as I do. So when Steve was like, oh, that's a really interesting idea, I was like, okay, but it really seemed like it worked really well. So it's actually pretty exciting. And we're planning on doing more comparisons, not just looking at the cliff face rooms relative to each other, which is what Steve started out with, but looking at some of these measures of how many times are floors repaired, how many times are structures repaired, how much remodeling evidence is there, do we see trash, do we see it under room floors, do we see it outside of rooms, comparing some of these things between cliff face sites and classic embrace ones to see if there really are differences in mobility and how long people are staying in one place when they're living in these sites. And it'll be very interesting to see how that turns out too, hopefully in the next year or so. One of the reasons that I think that that's really cool, the mobility part of this, is that it kind of explains some of the patterns that I've been seeing in the animal bones from this area. I'm really interested in how people change the animals around them, what resources are available when people start to live in an area, and what influence that has then on what people can do in that place. And one of the ways that I've tried to look at animals and how people are affecting animals is by looking at more and less resilient animals. So some animals are really resilient to the things people do. Other animals are really easy for people to impact with the things that we normally do. So, for example, big animals tend to be less resilient. Small animals tend to be more resilient. Big animals don't breed very fast. The little ones breed like rabbits. They breed really quickly. They quickly replace themselves if you hunt a bunch of them. Big and less resilient animals will often be a little bit more picky. Not all of the big ones, but the less resilient animals generally will have a little bit stricter habitat requirements sometimes, or some less resilient animals have a special diet that they need, whereas resilient animals, just like everything, they do great with weeds, they do great with fields, they do great with disturbance vegetation, and also natural vegetation, so they're not so picky. Both kinds can be delicious, but people tend to prefer animals that end up being less resilient. If people really, really prefer to hunt something, they'll put a lot of effort into finding the very last ones, and that makes those animals less resilient to what people are doing. People put a lot of effort into going out farther and farther to get an elk or a deer. Nobody puts that much effort into going out to find a rabbit unless you really, really need one for a specific reason. That doesn't happen a lot. So when you see like an elk head mounted on somebody's wall, that's a prestigious thing. If you see a bunny head mounted on someone's wall, that's a joke. That kind of is this difference in a nutshell between the prestige associated with some of the big, less resilient things and the lack of social prestige you often get from the little ones. That doesn't mean the little ones aren't important socially as well as for diet, but the effort people put into getting them is very different. So if you look at the more resilient and the less resilient animals, you start to see how the things that people are doing on the landscape and the way that they're living are affecting what animals they can get access to. I've been working on a project with Mike Deal, which I mentioned earlier, trying to gather as much data as we can from this region. He's working on plants, I'm working on animals. So this graph is showing you the relative abundance of the least resilient taxa over space and time. So we've got hundreds of years, a lot of different areas shown in this graph. You don't need to focus on them too much, but the dots at the top of the graph are showing you that there's a lot more big things, and the ones at the bottom are showing you that there's a lot more little less resilient things. And the thing to notice about it is this, at the very, very end, all those lines in the graph go up, right? And that means that there's more big things, big, less resilient animals. So in the cliff phase, this time period that I've been talking about, people seem to have a lot readier access to these less resilient kinds of animals. Why would that be? Because they're living in big villages again. You can see in a lot of the kinds of places I looked at, there's less access to those in the classic embrace. That's when there's a lot of people living in big villages. The reserve area is a little bit different for reasons I won't get into, but it does make sense. The early post-classic I mentioned there's very few people. And then in the cliff phase, we get a lot of people, but also a lot of these big animals. So when I first started to see this pattern, I was trying to figure out what happened. I thought, oh, maybe it's because of the 1200s. There weren't so many people living here in the 1200s, so the less resilient things kind of rebounded. And when a lot of people come back in the 1300s, they have better access to them. But kind of bothering me in the back of my head was that the cliff phase, if it's actually 1300 to 1450 plus, that's a long time period. It's about as long as the classic Memories period. And you wouldn't expect the rebound effect to really last that long. If you look at studies from places like the tropics, when humans move into a new area and start hunting like crazy, they affect the least resilient things within about 25 years. So you wouldn't see the big things staying in good shape for such a long period if it was really happening just because they rebounded in the 1200s. So if people are actually moving more, and we have this shifting sedentarism pattern, people are moving from valley to valley and they're actually not in these cliff face sites for as long, maybe that's also a big part of the reason that when people are living there, they have more access to the less resilient animals. People keep moving out and back in again, and when they move away, the animals kind of bounce back, and when they move back in, they kind of impact them again, and they move back and forth. The argument behind a lot of this research was that they were doing this for for farmland to let it lie fallow, because it's probably affecting the animals a lot as well. So if that mobility research actually turns out the way we think that it is, it could explain part of this animal pattern too. And I like it when multiple things kind of help explain each other. So that's pretty exciting to work on as well. So this also is potentially interesting news for problems that we have now, right? Because we have a lot of places where people are affecting resources, and especially if you look at the tropics, people in a lot of tropical environments have a hard time raising animals for meat. And so hunting is actually really important, not just culturally, but it's also an important way for people to get food. So if we want to understand how people can hunt and still maintain access to the animals that they need, it can be helpful to look at places that this has happened in the past. So if shifting sedentism is perhaps a way to keep a balance of what you can and can't hunt, that actually fits perfectly with what people have always done in those tropical environments. People have traditionally moved around quite a lot, and they would move away from a place and the animals would rebound. When they moved back, they had access to them again. So this supports that this kind of pattern works for a scale of many centuries. So those are some of the things that I think are really interesting and exciting about not just the Hoover Farm, but the upper Gila area in general, and the research that our project has been doing. And it's really, this slide to me kind of symbolizes a lot of different aspects of the project, because the screens that Will Russell is standing next to are screens from the early 1970s from the Midways Foundation. And they're screens that Steve LeBlanc, I believe, had made, and the Midways Foundation used them in the 70s. And then I used them when I was a student on Peggy Nelson's projects at ASU with Michelle Hedman. And then now we use them with our field school today. So this is like the third generation of project that's using those screens. And so those are very traditionally membrane muggy-owned screens that we have. And we're using them in the Upper Gila. And then Stacy Ryan is very happy to be holding this leaf blower. And that is a very traditional Hokum archaeological tool that I had not seen used before. And I thought it was a little bit weird, but I also hadn't worked in Adobe architecture before. And when all these people, archaeologists who'd come from a Hokum tradition, started using these leaf blowers to clear off Adobe walls, I was like, oh wow, that actually works great. So we have archaeologists who had a very muggy-owned background, and archaeologists who had a very Hokum background, and we were trained in different universities in different ways, and we've come together, and I think brought some of the best methods that we have together on this project. So we're all coming from different traditions, and at first we had to go through a process of kind of learning how to work together and deciding what kinds of pens to use and what kind of graph paper to use, and things that we felt very, very strongly about actually. But we worked it out, even though we were new to each other, and we formed this project that now has a new set of approaches to learning things. And I've met some of my very best friends on this project in exactly that way. So we brought all these traditions together, and I often think that that's a lot like what was probably happening here in the 1300s. People came from different places and they brought new things. Some people had perforated plates, some people didn't. And at first there was a little bit of trouble over it, but people came together and they kind of blended these different cultures together, and they found something that worked. So that's something that humans have always had to struggle with. We've always had to figure out, well, what do we do when we have these problems, and what do we do when everything's changing and people are moving? This comes up again and again. So this is a problem now that a lot of people are worried about, but it's not new. It's something that humans have always done. And it always makes me feel a little bit better to look back at examples like this from the past and say, this isn't a new problem, and people have successfully solved this in the past without everything turning out terrible. And so we can probably get through this now and solve these same kinds of problems, environmental and social problems, without everything turning out terrible either. So calm down a little bit, self. Archaeology can make me feel a little bit better about that. And looking at ways that people have done this successfully in the past can hopefully teach us a little bit about ways that we can do this now and give us some hope for the future. So thank you. You can see the many people who've supported us and funded us, including Arc and HIST. So we really appreciate that. And also the National Science Foundation, as I mentioned, which has let most of our students come. So thanks again for coming to hear me talk tonight, and thank you to everyone on the slide. Yes?
Karen, I was just wondering, have you guys tried doing GPR or anything else in terms of looking for these walls?
We tried at the Dinwiddie site. Was it magnetometry or GPR? Magnetometry. And it didn't work very well. Part of the trouble that we've had is that the Adobe's coming from the ground locally. So basically the walls are made out of the same dirt that the site is buried in. This is something we joke about when our students first come because they're wall trenching to find adobe walls, and it's all brown dirt. And we're like, oh, you did this slightly different color of brown dirt that's a little bit harder. And they're like, oh, geez. But 2 weeks later, they're going along with the pick, oh, here's the wall, oh, here's the wall. So it actually works. But because they're very, very similar, sometimes the same color and basically made out of the same thing, those things haven't worked very well yet. It does seem like it would be a great way of solving the plowed field problem, but a lot of these techniques, they just tend to work a little differently in every place depending on what the buildings are made of. But we've done really well with the shallow wall trenches, so we're actually a big fan of that. Yes?
Are all the perforations in plates one and then in unadorned plates?
Yes, this is, I think, a pottery type called Belfry Plain. Is that right, Jeff? But yeah, you see mend holes a lot on things, but they're actually put in after the vessel is fired. So often you'll see little holes in the rim of something, but they're actually drilled in later, and then the sherds are tied together to mend a crack or something like that. The perforations, you can see that they're put in when the clay is wet. So as far as I know, this particular thing with a plate-shaped thing with just perforations around the edge is a pretty unique kind of item. You'll see it in the ASM and things like colanders and stuff like that. Those are a little bit different. But yeah, we don't get things that are perforated plate-ish, if that's what you're asking. They're either very clearly one or they're very clearly not one. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is there any variability in the Adobe Construction technology differences between the ways that the walls are built?
There is a lot of variability in Adobe Construction, actually. That's something that Alan Denor is really interested in, since he's building these Adobe structures right now. He'll always come in and kind of make a mess poking around at our walls and looking at the different kinds of Adobe that are in them. At Hoover Farm, we can actually see differences between the north and south room blocks. The Adobe in the north room block is a much coarser kind of texture. It has a lot of gravel in it, and it really is almost exactly the same color as the fill, whereas in the south room block, the Adobe is a little bit smoother, and the walls are generally a little bit easier to recognize, which is nice since that's the one that was totally plowed over. The north room block still had a little more height. And then at the Dinwiddie site, we also saw different colors. Sometimes within one room, you can actually see color variations in the wall where people basically, it's puddled Adobe, so they're mixing it in a pit and they're scooping it up and they're sort of forming it along the wall. It's not bricks. And you can see where they laid basically something analogous to a course, and then it probably dried, and the next mix was from a slightly different place, the next course. And so there'll be like strips going up the wall of like browner versus grayer versus like an even darker brown, different colors that sort of getting it from different places. There's a lot of variation. And there's also variation in the foundations. One of the ways that archaeologists say you can recognize a cliff face site is these things called cementos, which are foundation stones. If you were to go read a book about this, it sounds like the cementos are always kind of a rebar. It sounds like there's always a trench, and then these cemento foundation stones in the bottom of the trench, and the adobe wall on top of it. But ours are quite variable. Sometimes the cementos look like they're just kind of stuck in there for show. There is no trench, there's just the adobe wall, and then there's a little flat stone stuck against the bottom of the outside of it. Sometimes we have two courses of cementos. Sometimes there's just one in the middle of the wall. Sometimes we have wall rocks high up. So there is actually a lot of variability in how these are built.
No cobbled adobe bases?
If you mean like a row of cobbles and then adobe on top of them.
Yes.
Yeah, we do have that. Yeah. Sometimes the things that archaeologists would call cemento are just a row of cobbles. There's one wall at Hoover Farm where they actually have two rows of cobbles on top of each other, and then adobe. We were joking that maybe people started to build a membrane Mogollon wall, and then they said, oh yeah, we're not doing that, and they put adobe on top. Because the bottom of it looks kind of like a membrane wall, two rows of cobbles and then the adobe on top. So yeah, it's really variable, and that's one of the things that to me is really interesting about this. There's not just one way to make a Salado building. There's a lot of different ways to do it. All the sites have different site plans, they all brew in different ways, so there's really a lot of ways to have a Salado community. There's a lot of variability in that. I think that's really neat.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, thank you again for coming.